I think somebody who's empathetic is willing to sit in a room and look at the other person and observe their body language and their facial expressions and their tone of voice and their word choices and assess how this person is handling things emotionally before the leader responds, so that they take that emotional impact into consideration. Because to me, that's what empathy is, making somebody feel seen and heard. And I think sometimes we think empathy is giving people advice or sharing our own experience. And really, that isn't always empathetic. Empathetic is listening. That is empathy. And so I think for me, if I'm looking at what makes an empathetic leader, I'm looking for a leader who observes more and speaks less. That's typically an empathetic leader.
Empathy in business and in leadership is a popular topic of late. But is there such a thing as too much empathy? I'm joined today by Stevie Dawn Carter, who is a keynote speaker, best-selling author, professor, and has a PhD in community college leadership, and we'll be talking about having better conversations, emotional intelligence, the role of empathy in leadership, what it means, and how to apply it well. As usual, we'll also be chatting about leadership more widely. The nature versus nurture debate comes up too, and we'll be hearing some of Stevie Dawn's insights from her own work and her career so far. Welcome back again to Leading with Integrity. This is episode 112. Now, here's the intro music while I get Stevie Dawn on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
I'm joined today by Stevie Dawn Carter. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show. Welcome to Leading with Integrity.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, David. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. And on that note, we're going to start by giving you the reins to introduce yourself, tell the listeners a bit about your career history, your background, what you get up to today, and why you do it.
Okay. Well, I have had a very, I would say, variety-based life in terms of I tried a lot of different things before I found what I'm doing today. But for the last 9 years, I've been a professional speaker, and I travel the country and talk about emotional intelligence, leadership, communication, and just try and help people to have better conversations. I feel like that's like my purpose in life, is to help people have better conversations. And I think that's because I have had terrible conversations in my life. I am horrifying sometimes at relationships. And so I feel like I am here to teach people what not to do by learning through my own examples. And that has just been an amazing experience. I love the travel. I love meeting new people. And when I'm not doing that, my husband and I run a community theater company here in our hometown. So at night, I work with actors and directors, and we put on shows and musicals. And so somebody told me the other day, no matter what you're doing, Stevie Dawn, you are on a stage. I said, well, that is probably accurate. And I think that's because that is where I feel the most comfortable. So yeah, that's me.
Well, there's a lot to be said, I think, for finding your comfort zone sometimes, isn't there? Whether it's a stage or for a lot of people, that's the very opposite of comfort zone.
I know. I get that a lot. People are like, how are you so comfortable? And I think the actual truth is, right, nature, nurture. Both sides of me were on a stage. So both my parents were musicians when they got pregnant with me. So music has always been in our life. My parents are both performers. So I think some of it is genetic. I'm going to say, like, it doesn't bother me. But also I started my stage career at 2 years old. My parents put me into dance. I was a professional dancer at 14. And so the stage is just comfortable for me. In fact, to the point that I think that's why sometimes I struggle with conversations and relationships, because I am great in front of a crowd of 500, but put me in a one-on-one setting, and that's a learning lesson for me. So I do feel like I'm quite opposite to people in that way sometimes, and probably why I put my foot in my mouth sometimes. But that really has been my journey. Like, the stage is where I feel comfortable. And I think, we say growth happens outside of your comfort zone, which I agree with. But I also think, as a leader and just as a human, knowing where you are meant to be and where your comfortable spot is not a bad thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I guess it's finding ways to push the comfort zone that is still relevant to what you're interested in, where your passion lies, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real trick of it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, right, like, for me, while I may be comfortable on stage, right, how do you push that to the next level, right? How do you do different things? And it wasn't always public speaking. That wasn't always where I was comfortable on stage. It was dancing and performing and being somebody else. There's definitely been a learning lesson in learning how to be myself on stage, which is very different, I feel.
Yeah, there's that whole authenticity piece, isn't there? And the other thing I think I really identify with in what you said there is about seeing things done the wrong way and helping people learn from your mistakes. That resonates with me from a leadership perspective as well. I think that's a lot of why I do what I do today, is having been through, certainly worked for some pretty bad leaders. I've probably been one at least once in my career. I'm sure former colleagues will be shouting about that to anyone who'll listen. And I think that's it, isn't it? There's a lot of stuff where people pick it up because they're inspired by seeing something done really well. And that's great. But I think it's quite unusual as well to be perhaps a bit like us, where we've seen it done badly and been like, right, how do we avoid that happening again?
Yeah. Well, and I sometimes think, right, we talk about it in dance a lot. There's natural gifts, right? People who are just naturally gifted and talented. And I think sometimes when you're learning from somebody who it's their natural gift, it can be kind of hard to learn from them because they don't know what the struggle is to learn it. They've just come to it naturally. And so I think for me, especially when I start talking to people about emotional intelligence, and I start my story by saying, like, I study this and I work on this because I know I had none of it. I came into emotional intelligence going, wow, this is why my relationships fail. I don't have any of this. I don't have self-awareness. I just say whatever I want and assume it's all okay. And so I think there's something about learning from somebody who has struggled that makes it feel like the lessons are more valid, just because you feel like, well, if I'm struggling with it, but they also struggled with it, then they're the people I want to teach me. I would always rather learn from somebody who had to work hard than somebody who is gifted, because I just feel like the lessons are different.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's a lot easier to respect a teacher if you know they've learned the lesson the hard way themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you need to respect someone to learn from them? That's a different question. I think probably yes. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. I think you need trust. I think you have to trust that they're going to give you the right information, or information that is valuable. And I think respect is definitely a part of trust, right? If I respect somebody, I tend to trust someone. And I think sometimes just we get on these paths in life where we need to learn, or we're struggling, or we're facing an obstacle. And I have just always found that the greatest lessons I have learned typically are either the hard way, through learning things poorly first time, or through learning from people who also went through those hard struggles, so that there's some relevance to the information. Because I think I think we see a lot in the online space, right? These gurus who tout the marketing and, make money overnight kind of things. And I will never forget, I read a book once, and the book was How to Become an Overnight Success. And the first sentence was, how I became an overnight success, 18 years in the making. And I kind of reference back to that a lot and say, I would rather learn from someone who it took them some time to figure it out, but they gritted through it, because to me, they have a lot more depth of lesson to give me than the person who, good for them, they got it right the first time. But that's not the average human. And that's definitely not been my experience. I don't think I get things right the first time, even the first 5 times. I think I'm like the 10th time queen, right? Like the 10th time we talk about it, I'm going to get it. But before that, who knows?
Practice makes perfect. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I'm with you there. I'm very skeptical about whether that overnight success is even possible or whether those guys are just charlatans and con artists. It's, I don't know. I think at best, if it has ever happened, it was luck and they've no idea how it happened. And so trying to teach anyone else to do it is a bit. Yeah.
Agreed. I feel that way so much. And so.
Especially when it comes to like the marketing and the business coaches and those type of people.
And we know that a large part of that is luck, and good for them. I'm proud that they're lucky. Like, that's great. But I like, when somebody's like, oh, I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, you probably have some knowledge of things that have gone wrong in the last 25 years to teach me something, So
definitely. Yeah. But even then, like if they're still billing it as how to be an overnight success, but you haven't, it took you 25, unless you've done it 25 times. Right.
Every year, you're a new overnight success every year.
Yeah. And even then, that's not really overnight, is it? It took you a year.
It still took you a year. Yeah, we can't do it.
Yeah. So something else you mentioned earlier that I'd love to get into a little bit. You referenced nature versus nurture. And then we started talking about empathy, and I think leadership falls in this category as well.
Yeah.
Is it possible that you can be born with these skills, or are they learned and developed skills?
Yeah. I feel that, so me personally, I would say I was not born with it at all. I think that we all have a level of emotional intelligence and empathy that is programmed into our genetic DNA. And I think that is from just evolution and us being able to have conversations with people and just kind of get through life. I think there's an element, there's like a foundational level that we're all given in nature. I think the rest is all nurture. And what I say to people all the time is, if you want to get better at emotional intelligence and empathy, talk to more humans, because that's how you get better at it. It's a relationship skill. So the more you talk to humans, the more relationships you build, the better at it you will be. And I think in my early phase of life, my family moved a lot. So I never really established long-term relationships until I was in my 20s, because we just moved all the time. And I think because of that, I became very lone wolf, right? Very much about me and my needs and what I was getting out of things, and not really trying to build relationships with people. And so, yes, maybe I dated, but it wasn't successful, and I was moving all the time anyway, so I didn't care for it to be successful. So I do think that you learn these skills through that nurturing, but I think that depends on your life and what your life is doing. So for me, I didn't start realizing that these were problems I had until my early 20s, because my life had always been, well, you're not really building relationships with people anyway, so who cares, right? Who cares if it goes well? Who cares if you're good at it? It doesn't matter. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're all built with a little bit of it programmed into us, but I think people who really cultivate it in themselves, they do that because they seek out long-term, trust-filled relationships, both personally and professionally. And that's the number one way to build those skills.
Interesting. Not the answer I was expecting, actually.
Oh, okay. I love that. I love when I surprise people.
Yeah, well, I mean, half the answer I was expecting, I suppose. Yeah, I always struggle with this one, particularly this idea of in the leadership context. There's that phrase in there, the natural born leader. Mm-hmm. Now, I very much disagree with that as a concept. I don't think that's a thing. No one comes out of the womb instantly a leader, right? There's no genome for that. No. At least as far as I know. Yeah. I have looked in the research. I haven't found it yet.
I haven't found it. No.
Yeah. If any listener knows where it is, please feel free to send it in. And I think that there's things like that, particularly where there's human connection, there's interpersonal relationships, conversations, empathy, all of those sort of concepts, that has to be a learned behavior, surely. And so that's why I'm really interested that you said that there is an aspect of it that is kind of in your genes.
Yeah. And I think that's because, right, as humans, we're programmed to be tribe-based people. If that is something that you believe in, and I know not everybody does, and that's okay. But from what I've looked at from a research base and from a science base, we are genetically predisposed to be a tribe-based people. And that means you're somewhat genetically predisposed to making sure the tribe survives. So there's an element of community that is in our genome. There's an element of people that is in our genome. I think we're genetically predisposed to want belonging and connection and these kinds of things. Now, do you already know how to do it well? No, I think that's what the learned behavior is. But is there a desire to have that connection? Yes, I think that's in our genome and that's there. And I think some people do come into the world, not necessarily with it in their genes, but through their family, through how they're raised. They can get better at it a lot quicker than others, right? So like there's research out there that shows people who are born into larger families with more siblings and more aunts and uncles and more relationships at a young age tend to have empathy and emotional intelligence at a younger age over the people who, like me, single child, right? Only child, the only one in the household, just my parents and I, no large family. So for me as a child, the only relationships I had to worry about were my parents. That was it. I didn't build a lot of relationships with other people. So I think while there is some genetic predisposition, it really is those formative years. And what do you do during those that maybe makes people, once they maybe interact with you or I as a leader later in life, we can say, well, that was probably part of their upbringing, right? They kind of had some of that given to them through their family. So they may not remember, quote unquote, learning it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a learned thing through their family.
Okay. I think I'm coming around to your point of view. So next question, another concept here that really interests me, and it's sort of related to what we're talking about. Things like sort of sociopathy, psychopathy, they sit on the extreme edges of the spectrum, let's say. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you look at some of the traditional approaches to leadership in terms of the way they view the people they're leading, mm-hmm. I don't think it's unfair to say those behaviors are more like a sociopath than someone who's less, I don't want to use the word normal, but a more average kind of personality, and someone who is, as you say, genetically predisposed towards a community and building those personal relationships. Why is it then, do you think, that has become, at least until recent years, the norm of leadership in a business setting? Mm-hmm. Difficult one, I know.
Yeah, no, it is a hard one. Not that I want to say all leaders are sociopaths, because they're not in any way, shape, or form.
Of course not. No.
But there is an element of, I guess, distance or disengagement, that a boundary, let us say, that's a better word for it. There is a boundary that has to exist for a leader to be effective. And that boundary can sometimes show up as coldness, as people not caring about others, as a leader being a narcissist, or maybe having more of those tendencies towards not caring about people's feelings or not making true connections with people. And I think that that's because for a long time, we treated leaders as bosses. And to me, those are two separate words, right? So the boss is the one who tells you what to do. And for a long time, those were one and the same. A leader was your boss. And so the boss had to tell you what to do. And if you weren't doing it right, they had to tell you were doing it wrong. And your whole job was to make sure the boss was happy. And we lived in that society for a long time. And I think that promotes some of that coldness or aloofness in a leader, because when I'm supposed to just tell you what to do and you're supposed to want to do what I tell you what to do, there isn't necessarily a lot of this give and take vulnerability side. As we have shifted away from an industrial society to an information society, that's really where we see that changing, because now we value knowledge, and knowledge is something that not only leaders have, but now everybody has access to knowledge, and everybody has access to education and the internet and all these things. And as that access to education and information grows, then our leaders stopped becoming bosses and started becoming inspirers, encouragers, supporters. And that's a much more human, connected way to look at leadership than we used to. And it's because now we have leaders who are leading people who know more than they do. And that wasn't the case 40 years ago. 40 years ago, if you worked on the assembly line under a leader, it's because that leader had worked the assembly line before you. And they moved up and they moved up and they moved up. Now we have people that we put into leadership tracks that have never done the work. So how can I inspire you to be better? How can I inspire you to do good things? I can't do it by just telling you to do it and you're supposed to just trust me. That no longer works, because how we've set up our work and how we work in this new society doesn't work like that. So now leaders have to make connections. They have to gain trust and rapport at a much higher level, because they're leading people who know that leader can't do what I do. They don't know how to program in this code. They don't know how to make this widget, right? But they're leading me to do so. So how do I make that connection? So I think that's really the shift we've seen, is as work has shifted, as society has shifted from industrial to informational, then that type of leadership, from kind of having some of those more negative tendencies to trying to be this more humanistic, holistic piece, that's why we're seeing that shift.
Yes, I think I agree with you. I like narcissism better as a word for what I was trying to say earlier as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know why that didn't pop into my head, but yeah, it is interesting, particularly given the shift to an information economy. It'll be interesting to see where that goes in the near future with AI as well. I agree with you. I think there is a parallel, though, to what we were talking about earlier about a teacher having been there and understood the thing before you can respect what they're trying to teach you. And I think there is a parallel there to leadership as well. And I do sit on the fence for this one, because I do firmly believe that leadership can be its own specialism and should be. Mm-hmm. And if we believe that, if we see that as good, then it shouldn't necessarily be a requirement that every leader has walked the factory floor or the office floor or whatever the equivalent is in your industry. But then at the same time, I think it's a lot easier to respect someone and work for them and towards the goal that they want you to achieve if you know they've been in your shoes previously. Yeah.
Well, I think you're so right. I think I would agree. I probably sit on the fence on this as well. Or maybe it's just I try and encourage leaders to go back and learn things they didn't know. But you're so right. I think that as a world, we've made now leadership its own industry. There are people who have just become leaders, and they lead in different industries in different ways, but they don't necessarily have 20 years of experience on the ground floor of that industry. They're just a good leader. They're a good supervisor. They're a good manager. However, I think if they are a good leader and they are a good supervisor, they are a good manager, then one of the first things they should be doing is learning the jobs that those people do. Doesn't mean you have to do it better than them. Doesn't mean you will have had the years of experience of them. But if you can at least understand what their daily life looks like, you're going to be able to make a stronger connection with them. Right. And so I kind of think yes, that's probably the case. It's easier to respect somebody who's been in your shoes. But at the same time, if they're a good leader, they're learning how to do that anyway. So even without working the ground floor. So I think it kind of, maybe it solves itself in good, effective leadership, but maybe it is something that ineffective leaders don't spend enough time doing, is learning what their people do.
Really agree with that. Really, really agree. I was going to say exactly that, in fact, but I think when it comes to the ineffective ones, maybe that's where it exposes perhaps some of the intellectual laziness, perhaps, about if you know that you've been and done the job yourself, you can just rely on that, and you don't have to be as inquisitive. You don't have to go and ask those questions because you think you already know it. Not always right, I would add.
No. One of the things that makes a great leader is somebody who's always willing to learn, because we also know that if you did the job 20 years ago, that's not the same way the job is done now. And if you haven't taken the time to go back and learn how people are doing the job now, you're probably missing out as well. Right. So definitely. I think that's both sides of that as that too.
Yeah. And I think that's where the humility piece comes in, isn't it? And not being too caught up in your own idea of your own importance to resist just going and asking someone a question like, how does this work? What does that do? How do you do this? Those kind of questions. And I think someone in the past has said it to me, but I think as a leader, you can't be afraid of looking stupid.
No.
They phrased it much more eloquently than I just have. But it's you've got, I think that really sums it up, because you've got to be able to just go and ask the stupid question.
Yeah.
And I think back to school as well. Like there was always that thing where the teacher would ask the question at the end of a class or a lecture or whatever. And I always had this in my head because someone very early in my school life had said to me, always ask the question. Don't be afraid of looking stupid, because 9 times out of 10, there'll be at least 3 other people in the room who have the same question, but they're scared to ask. So you're doing them a favor by doing that. And that's always stuck with me from a leadership point of view as well. It's the same principle, isn't it? If you aren't prepared to ask the stupid question, you're letting down your people, because someone else needs that answer too, probably.
You are. Well, and I think one of the lessons I learned in kind of studying emotional intelligence and relationship building is questions equal connection, right? So if we are always doing the talking, making statements, we're not connecting to another human. You only connect to another human through asking questions. And that can be about their personal life or their family or whatever, but it can also just be at the workplace asking questions about their job. Like, tell me about how you do that. Like, what does that look like for you? And I think too often what we get stuck in is we ask questions to pass judgment instead of asking questions based on curiosity. Right? So a leader going into a conversation and knowing that they don't know X, Y, and Z, and being willing to say, hey, I don't know X, Y, and Z. I would love it if you could teach me. That's going and being curious, versus I think a lot of times we ask people why questions, and we think why questions are healthy, because in theory they can be. But truly, if a leader comes at you every day asking, well, why did you do that? That is not going to sound like a question of curiosity. That is always going to sound as a question of judgment. And so I think it's also I think step 1 is learning to ask questions and feeling okay asking questions, right? To your point there, it's not about looking stupid or being dumb. It's just learning more, and probably somebody else has the question. So you're doing them a favor. You're taking one for the team, right? So I think step 1 is asking questions, but then I think step 2 is making sure we ask questions in the right manner, so that we're not asking questions that shut people down, but we're asking questions that light people up. And I think that's another piece of the puzzle that can easily get missed.
It's like the loaded questions, isn't it? The leading questions in the courtroom. I know exactly what you mean. And that's definitely a trap I've fallen into in the past. Asking why, because I genuinely wanted to know why. But the way it's perceived when you use that it's funny, isn't it? How some words take on their own meaning.
They do indeed. I tell leaders all the time in our programs, I'm like, look, why can be your best word. It can also be your sharpest weapon. So you have to decide which way you're using it today. And that is hard, because it's not everybody comes from a place where they see that difference in just it's one word. How can it be so different? But it really can, asking somebody, why did you get involved with what you do? That has a softness, that has a curiosity component. But at the same time, I can ask that same question. So why did you get into that? All of a sudden, Now that doesn't sound free of judgment. That sounds like you made a dumb choice and I'm wondering why you did that, right? So I think it's so hard because really communication and leadership comes down to those nuances. And it comes down to being able to adapt. And so to take a word that seems innocuous just as a word, but to go, how can I use that word in different ways? And how do I make sure it's getting the message I want, right? So I tell people all the time, it doesn't matter what you say, it only matters what they hear. So while I can say I was being curious, if they don't hear that as curiosity, it didn't matter.
The example that always sticks in my mind is the 5 whys.
Yeah.
Which is a root cause analysis tool, it appears in quality management, all sorts of different things. And the contrast version of that is the toddler who just keeps asking why over and over and over again because they know it annoys you, right?
Yeah.
It's exactly the same word. It's the same principle. You repeat the same question until you get to the answer.
Yeah. But how is one okay and the other one is not okay,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
No, it's such a good example of the two. I love that.
We've mentioned a bit about empathy. I think we as a society, certainly in the leadership world, in personal development, in management as well, to a lesser extent, we talk a lot these days about emotional intelligence and EQ. What do those phrases actually mean, though? Because I think sometimes that gets lost in the translation. And why are they important?
Yeah. Well, so first off, EQ means the emotional quotient, and it actually goes to a test. There's a test called the EQI. And it was a test that got a lot of popularity for a while, which is why people started saying EQ. But your EQ is actually your ability to have emotional intelligence. What's your number? How good are you at it? Right? So a lot of people use EQ and EI as interchangeable, but they're actually two separate things, because one is talking about the score you got on a test. What is your emotional quotient within something, versus what is your emotional intelligence? So I try and use EI more, even though sometimes I still say EQ because it became common vernacular in our country. And so I definitely still fall into that trap. But emotional intelligence really is about being able to manage your emotions, observe the emotions of others, and assess the impact. And I think that last phrase is the part most people miss out of it. I think we have a lot of people who are self-aware. They try and manage their own emotions. That's great. Step one. I think we have some people, specifically leaders, who learn to observe the emotions of others. Also good. But really where it becomes useful is you have to assess the impact it's having on your life. Is it impacting your decisions? Is it impacting your conversations? Is it impacting your relationships? Really having a high emotional intelligence or having a high EQ is being able to assess the impact emotions are having in your life. And then to take that one step further and say, how do we make adjustments? How do we adapt to that? So I think, like, for me, I went through a large part of life not understanding that when I was speaking, my emotions were coming out my language and my facial features. And I didn't really think about that. I didn't know about that. And so I would just talk and then later be like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. But I had done nothing to assess what I was going to say was going to impact them, right? I just kind of let it be, well, they know what I mean, right? I made a lot of assumptions that people just got it. And that caused me a lot of strife, especially as a new leader. When I had my first leadership gig, I just led all kinds of wrong because I really didn't assess the impact my emotions have on people. And I'm a hugely emotional person. So my emotions have an even greater impact because I'm a super emotional person on others. And I just wasn't aware of that. So I think that's why it's important, because we all are emotions. That's part of a human experience. We all have those emotions. But how are we assessing the impact those are having in our life and in our leadership? And then how are we making adjustments?
Thank you. Yeah, it's well explained. I think the management or the regulation piece at the end is really important as well, I think, especially for leaders. Mm-hmm. And it is really difficult, though, especially with other buzz phrases that are quite popular these days, such as authenticity and vulnerability.
Yes.
About knowing where to draw that line about how much is you being honest about your emotions and how much is inappropriately putting your emotions onto your colleagues.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad you bring that up, because I do fight the battle of vulnerability pretty much every day in my work. Because people are like, well, we're told to be vulnerable. We're told to be vulnerable. Yes. And being vulnerable as a leader means saying when you've made a mistake, being honest about your own knowledge, your own levels, those kinds of things. Being vulnerable does not mean sharing about your divorce, how you lost your dog, or what your dating life was like this weekend. And I think that's where we've made the problem, right? Is we've decided that vulnerable means I share my whole life story with the people I lead. And I think that is the number one way to lose respect and authority as a leader, is to share your life story. Number one, people don't really care. Their life is not about you. And number two, you might share something that makes them now judge you or feel differently about you, which now lessens your leadership. So I think we do have to be careful to say vulnerability in what way? Vulnerability to say it's okay to not have a good day. And as a leader today, I'm not having a good day. Sure. I encourage people to be honest with how they're feeling any given day. But there's a difference in telling people how you're feeling and telling people why you're feeling that. And I think sometimes as leaders, that's the boundary. I want to be vulnerable enough to tell you, I'm actually not feeling great today, guys, but I'm going to soldier on through. That's vulnerable, but not saying, here's why I'm not feeling today, guys, because I'm going through this fight with my husband. You don't need to know that. That doesn't impact our work. That doesn't impact what we're doing. All you need to know is that, hey, I'm having a bad day. So if I seem a little short today, I'm so sorry. It's not meant, right, to be that way. That's vulnerability as a leader. But I think we have to make sure as leaders, we're still establishing boundaries, right? And to me, that's one of the things I battle as I go around and talk about emotional intelligence, is people then say, well, but vulnerability says I share. You don't share everything, right? Learn to share the things that connect you to people without sharing too much personal information that then lessens your authority.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said around authenticity there as well. And the two words become a bit synonymous as well. I don't think that's necessarily the case either.
Mm-hmm.
Does authenticity mean that you might be a bit more open with your colleagues than you would have been 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago? Yes. Mm-hmm. Does it mean you tell them everything you're doing outside of work all the time and send them pictures of your dinner and all that kind of nonsense that you see on social media?
Yeah.
No.
I
think there is also, though, there's an aspect of it will flex depending on how long you've known these people, how long you've worked together, how deep that relationship actually is. There will be a point, I would expect, naturally in that relationship where, yeah, you are telling each other about your lives. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that necessarily harms your leadership if you do it in the right way and you don't overshare. Yeah. If anything, it can improve it as long as you manage it correctly.
Yeah. But I think it's managing it correctly. I think it's sometimes, like you said, they're all buzzwords and phrases that we just use or get thrown around, but are we actually teaching the concepts, the boundaries, the structure around that? And I think when you're with a team for a long time, you're going to know a lot about each other. You're going to know a lot about each other's families and each other's moods. And I think that's a normal part of the human process. But I always caution leaders to say, at any point, if sharing this piece of information will make them think I'm less of a leader, then maybe I shouldn't be sharing it. And that's just something to think about. I think sometimes we get so into just talking and just conversing that we forget to always, you're still wearing that leadership hat. Even if we're just talking about what we did last weekend, you're still wearing that leadership hat. Is what you're about to say a leadership quality they will respect? Because I think as a leader, you're allowed to be whoever you want to be at home. I have no judgment on that. But once you share it at work, it's in work. Now I get to pass judgment. And I think we have to train leaders to think about that, because it gets real easy to get so comfortable with people that we just share. And then later, those become issues. And I'll give you an example. Had a leader who shared with their supervisor or with their team, the leader shared with the team that they had recently gone through a difficult breakup, right? And it had been contentious, right? And they'd known each other for years. So that wasn't necessarily anything they wouldn't need to know. Like, oh, you were, with Bill, you're not with Bill anymore. Okay. But this leader shared so much about how it was just wrecking her and tearing her apart and all of these things. And about a week and a half later, there was an issue at work, and the leader handled it to the best of their ability in that moment. And then it got taken to HR. And what was reported to HR is, well, I know this leader is unstable because they're going through all this stuff at home. So I don't think they handled this correctly. That's hard, right? This leader thought they were with somebody they trusted and that was okay. But what they did is they gave them ammunition so that when this employee then didn't want to follow the rules, didn't want to do the thing, this employee now has something that they can say, well, I don't think you're handling this correctly because you're going through it. And that's where we have to be careful as leaders. So I think it's a hard line. And I know I cross it back and forth all the time. So nobody is perfect in it. But I do think we have to be careful because as a leader, you can't afford to give up that power and that authority when you need it. And so talking to people and sharing your life is great, but let's make sure we're not giving them an ammunition for why they don't have to listen to us next week.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I think there's the flip side of it as well, though, where that outside of work situation is used to excuse poor behavior at work.
Exactly.
And that's not restricted to leadership either, of course.
No, right? So in all fairness, right, I'm not in the situation. Maybe the leader did react poorly to what was happening, and maybe they should have been written up by HR, right? Because maybe they didn't handle it well. Like, that's all fairness, yes. The leader also has to learn how to manage those emotions at work so that it's not a problem. But I do think as leaders, when you're sharing that kind of insight, it can be taken wrong. And you never want to think bad of people. You never want to think they're going to use it against you. But in this particular case, it was used against them. And that's unfortunate for everybody involved. And that definitely is not the norm. That's not the thing that happens every day. But I do think it's a cautionary tale to say there are limits, boundaries that we need to keep as leaders. And that doesn't mean you can't share about your life. And that doesn't mean you can't be a human. But you always need to remember there's still a leadership hat on your head. And what does that come with responsibility wise? Yeah,
it's the impossible to answer questions spring up, don't they? Like, would it have been reported had they not known about the outside of work problem? Right. That's one. The other question is, would they have done it or handled it that way had they not also been dealing with the out of work problem?
Exactly.
And it's,
all of those.
It is interesting.
Yeah. And so, I don't think there's any right answer. I think every leader has to figure it out for themselves and do what suits them. But I always caution my leaders to say, hey, leadership can be one of the most rewarding things you will ever do. And you will be able to impact people and transform lives. And with great power comes great responsibility. And so always thinking about, I always say we should be friendly, not necessarily friends. And there are limits to that. And you should always watch your boundaries and make sure that you are holding yourself to the leadership standard you wish other people would. And that's all we can ask ourselves to do, really.
Indeed. So a conversation I had a few weeks ago with a guy, his name was Anthony Levopa. He's commander in the US Navy. Wow. So he's a really long career. And he was talking about, which is relevant here, I think. He was talking about the difference between leadership and authority. Now, obviously, in a military setting, authority is a given. Like, that's very clear. Everyone can literally see it. You're wearing it.
Yes.
But his argument essentially was, if that authority is a given, then you don't have to rely on that. It's there. It's unavoidable. And if you can then focus on the leadership, you can still have those proper kind of communications. You can have sensible discussions with people without having to always be stamping down your authority all the time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a great lesson for leadership in any context. Well, obviously, it's very literal in that example.
Yeah. Well, and also, I think that brings up the question of how in a non-military setting, when it's not obvious, I mean, we all know there are employees who push on our authority, who test it, right? If it's not obvious, how are you still putting your authority there without, right, beating them over the head with it? Because I don't agree with that, right? I think you should always be transformational and coaching over putting people down or telling people what to do, right? I still prefer leader over boss. But if that authority is not a given, how do you establish it? And how do you keep it, even when trying to do all these other pieces of leadership? One of the great things about military, about police, about some of these institutions, even education, the authority is written into the hierarchy, and nobody in the hierarchy can argue with it because it was there when you signed on. But now in an office, at a CPA firm or in an office building, is that authority as structured and as just accepted? Or are there people in there who are pushing on that authority and saying, I don't know that you're the boss of me. I don't know that I should take from you, right? And so then as a leader, how do you establish that authority without putting your boot on their throat, right? Without being mean or belittling or demeaning to somebody, but still needing to establish your authority. Because especially as younger generations are taught, because younger generations are being taught to challenge authority. That is something they are being taught to do. How are we as leaders then using that authority and showing that authority without crossing those lines? I think that's a really tricky question, right?
Yeah, I agree. It is a tricky question. I think personally, in a military setting, there's no choice, right? You signed on, you're there, you're stuck.
Yep.
That doesn't necessarily mean in an office environment, let's say, that the authority isn't still a given. I think in a lot of ways it is. There's a contractual relationship. They're paying your salary. They can let you go whenever, depending on which market you're working in. That authority does still exist. I wonder, there's probably people who push against it even in the military.
Oh, for sure. Of course there are, right?
And I think this is why, though, the distinction between the two concepts is so important.
Yeah.
And I think this is why leadership should be the first port of call, not being a boss, not relying on authority. Because if you have to rely on the contract or withdrawing pay,
and you've already lost all the
or threatening to sack them, then you've already failed. Frankly.
For sure.
So
agreed.
I think that's why in the modern workplace you've got to lead with things like empathy. You've got to be authentic to a point. You've got to be vulnerable in a productive way. You've got to be thinking about serving your people more than you're thinking about what you're getting from them.
Yes.
And I think if you can't do any of those things, then your business is going to be in trouble pretty quickly anyway.
Exactly. Well, and I think it's such a good reminder of just, if you have to rely on authority to get people to do things, then you haven't done a great job of establishing relationships.
Definitely. And you're not a leader.
Yeah. You're not leading at that point. You're just the boss. And that's okay. And if that's where it is, that's where it is, right? But we should all strive for more.
It is okay, I suppose, in certain settings.
Well, I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying that if that's where it's gotten to, see, the problem is people think then, well, I've got to fix it. A lot of times, if you've already gotten that far down, you're not fixing it. They need to move on to another job. You need to move on to another job because there's no fixing it. If you've gotten that far down, it's okay because you have no option. It gets the job done. Right. Yeah, okay. But you need to be looking at what's next for you, because if you're at that point and the relationships are so poor, they're very hard to get back.
Can't disagree with you there, unfortunately. Okay, so we've just noticed the time. We've barely covered any questions. Let's pick another
I know.
question.
It was been a very interesting conversation.
It has. This is what happens, you see. I forget about the questions because I get so intrigued by something that we've talked about.
I love it.
And I go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So one more question then about the empathy side of things. What is it you think that makes someone an empathetic leader?
I think somebody who is an empathetic leader observes others before they speak. I think somebody who's empathetic is willing to sit in a room and look at the other person and observe their body language and their facial expressions and their tone of voice and their word choices and assess how this person is handling things emotionally before the leader responds, so that they take that emotional impact into consideration. Because to me, that's what empathy is, making somebody feel seen and heard. And I think sometimes we think empathy is giving people advice or sharing our own experience. And really, that isn't always empathetic. Empathetic is listening. That is empathy. And so I think for me, if I'm looking at what makes an empathetic leader, I'm looking for a leader who observes more and speaks less. That's typically an empathetic leader.
I like that. Yeah, especially the listening point. I mean, there's the cliche, isn't there, about 2 ears and 1 mouth, but you've got 2 eyes as well. So observation just as important.
That's it. And I think that's really where leaders can make the biggest impact, is just when you roll into a meeting, don't be the first person to talk. And I know that's hard as a leader sometimes because we're leaders and that's okay. But to be able to go into that room and start with a question, hey, how's it going? Hey, how's life? Hey, how are you? And then take time to observe them before you go down your agenda, you will have been more empathetic in that moment, especially if you've adjusted for those emotions.
Yeah, not to get into my hatred of meetings.
No, I mean, we all have them.
No, but I do think it is a difficult one, because I think there is that, it's almost like a social expectation, isn't there, that the leader will be doing most of the talking.
Yep.
Whereas actually it's the opposite. If you go into a meeting, I mean, first of all, a meeting should be the end result of a conversation where you make a decision. It shouldn't be a give away all the information, let everyone listen and make. Yeah. Anyway, putting that aside, if you've gone into a meeting and as the leader, you've done all the talking and everyone else has sat in silence for the whole time, then something's wrong somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I do think that's super important as leaders to just make sure we're listening first. Mm-hmm. And it does kind of go against the social construct of leaders lead the meetings, but you can lead the meetings with questions, and that's how you get other people to talk. And so that's the way to force your listening, is to just be asking questions instead of giving statements. Yep.
I like that a lot. What has been your own best experience of being led?
My best experience being led was under the president of the last college I worked at, which was Tarrant County College. We had a leader named Dr. Tahita Fulkerson. And she was an empathetic, transformational leader in all ways. But what I remember most, and the story I always tell, is when I met her, it was my first day on the job. They're doing the whole take you around, show you the tour, of campus. And we're walking around, and there's a woman, a very well-dressed woman, about 100 yards right in front of us as my supervisor and I are walking down the hall. And she stops to pick up trash and put it in the trash bucket, right? Which is fine. That's great, And my supervisor turns to me and he says, hey, that's the president of the college. And by the way, that's what she expects us all to do. If you see trash on campus, you pick it up and you put it away. If you see a student struggling, you stop and you talk to them. She would rather you be late to a meeting because you helped a student. She would rather the campus look nice for students because we helped clean it up. That is who she is as a leader, and that is what she will expect you to be. And I have never forgotten that is how I met her later that day. We didn't talk to her in that moment, but that was the first introduction to her I got, was her bending down in her nice suit to pick up trash and throw it away at a college. And I just felt that exemplified the type of leader that she was and the type of staff she expected all of us to be. She led by example in that. And that was one of the biggest leadership lessons I ever learned. So Yeah, she was my favorite.
That is a great story. Yeah. I mean, leading by example, also very clear display of what the priority is as well. It's the student experience in that case, putting the people first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it was great. Miss her a lot.
Right. Difficult question for you now.
Okay.
If you could go back in time, how far back in your own life would you go? And what would you say to your younger self?
I think I would probably go back to my early 20s, and I would say to myself, you don't just get one career, you get as many as you want. Because there was a time in my life where I really felt like once I had an injury and dance was no longer an option for me as a professional career, I really spent a couple of years just kind of not understanding what I was going to do with my life, kind of feeling like that was the only thing, that was the only career. And so what else did I have to offer the world? And I see so many people do that in life. Like now, as I'm older, I even see younger people like at 27, 28 years old saying, oh my gosh, I don't have it figured out. What if this isn't the job I want for the rest of my life? And I just want to scream at them, like, you can have as many careers as you want. You can change your mind as many times as you want. So don't get lost in that. Don't get lost in trying to pick the thing forever. Pick something right now that interests you. And when it stops interesting you, you'll pick something else. And I think if I had heard those words and felt that way then, I would have been able to pick up myself and my career a lot faster. It took me quite a few years of floundering because I really thought that I was only good at one thing and could only do one thing. And so I think I would tell myself that's not true.
I think sometimes it's just important to go and do something as well, isn't it? Even if, especially if you don't know what you want to do, go and try something. You might not enjoy it. Fine, move on to something else. You know, there's low stakes then, isn't there? Like
Absolutely. You're not really. Absolutely. And I think that's super important just to keep going. You have to keep moving. You got to keep doing something, you know?
Yeah. I think, in hindsight, I kind of envy the people who didn't really know what they wanted to do when they were at school. Because you don't become tied to anything emotionally then, and you can be a bit more flexible if something doesn't work out.
And try new things. And they probably ended up trying things that they even surprised themselves with, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, no doubt. And they've probably had much more interesting and varied careers than they would have.
Than I have, yeah.
Well, certainly than I have, It's a struggle, that one. I do think there's way too much pressure in those teenage and early 20s kind of years when you're at college and all of that. You're expected to know what you're going to do the rest of your life for your career. Right? Even today, when people change jobs every year. Yeah. It's a weird one, that.
It is. There really isn't. We still ask somebody at 18 to make a choice for the rest of their lives, even though we all know it's not for the rest of their lives. Yet we still kind of make it feel that way. And I think that does them a disservice because that's not accurate,
Definitely. I think it's the great con of adulthood, that, isn't it?
Yeah, right?
Because we all know, and yet we're still telling them.
Yes. Absolutely.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, last question. This one's my favourite one. It might not be your favourite, but we'll find out.
Okay.
It's called Leadership Heroes.
Okay.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
I'm not good at remembering fictitious leaders or historical leaders. I'm terrible at all that. So I'm not even going to try. I will say there was a leader that I got to engage with for a couple years of my life, about 15 years ago now. And she just had a way of, you never doubted her authority. You never doubted that she was in charge, but never in a way that was mean or belittling. And she just always had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. And even when she was telling you something you didn't want to hear, somehow coming from her, it was okay. I think it's because she knew you were safe, that she was going to take care of you and protect you, even when you made mistakes. And she just really embodied for me what it's supposed to be a leader in a corporate setting. She wasn't always the most inspirational. She didn't have all the flowery words or any of that, but just day to day leading us to get through the work with a smile on her face and not get overwhelmed and not burn out. She always had a way of just making us understand that she had our back, that she was going to expect a lot of us, but that we were always safe and we were always protected. And I will never forget feeling that way around her. And then as I went on to lead after her, always trying to think about what did she do that I could then do to people or for people, because I think that she just really showed me what a good everyday leader boss could be, in a way that never felt like, I mean, she was vulnerable, she was authentic, all of the things, but just always had authority, always had respect, and just always had my back. And that was something I really valued and treasured about her. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. It's one of those key behaviors, isn't it, of leaders that are maybe not always the most successful in terms of financial or even like rising up the ranks in the corporate world. Mm-hmm. But from the point of view of the people they're leading, they're always the best ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that's sometimes the myth of leadership is that all leaders are these major, impactful, life-changing humans doing this incredible work, where I actually feel probably some of the best leaders are ones we've never heard about.
Oh, definitely. And I think most of the ones that would spring to mind who are doing those great works and all the inspirational speeches and all that probably aren't that great to work for. Right. Probably aren't very good leaders, actually, on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. It is a funny one, that, definitely.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, it's been lovely chatting with you today. The last thing I will ask you is if any of the listeners want to learn more about what you do, perhaps get in touch, would you like to point towards your website or similar?
Yes. So you can always find me on LinkedIn at Stevie Dawn Carter, or you can visit our website at empathics.net and see all the programming we have there for emotional intelligence.
Awesome. Well, Stevie Dawn, thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely chatting. Thank you.
It has been a pleasure. And I hope you continue to have a great rest of you're probably in the afternoon and I'm in the morning, but a great rest of your time and day today, whatever that looks like for you.
Well, likewise. Yeah. Have a great rest of your day, week, month, year, etc.
Yes. All the things.
Thank you so much again to Stevie Dawn for your time and conversation today. Really enjoyed that, and we covered loads of little pearls of wisdom there about empathy, communication, leadership, and even life at large. Listener, thank you for being with us today. I hope you found value in what we've spoken about. And if you would like to learn more about Stevie Dawn and the work that she does, then you'll find all of the relevant links in the episode description. And as always, don't forget to visit www.leadernotaboss.com to sign up to my newsletter or join our Integrity Leaders online community. I hope you'll be with us again next week when I'll be interviewing a fighter pilot, former Top Gun instructor, and previous commander of the US Navy display team, the Blue Angels. His name is George Dom, and he has some amazing stories and leadership lessons to share with us. So don't miss it. Join us again Wednesday next week. And until then, be a leader, not a boss.